On July 4th, beneath a sky filled with flags and brass band fanfare, a girl's silent plea pierced through centuries of ritual. Elias Monroe, a stoic ceremonial guard and forgotten father, had one job: never break formation. But when a young black girl locked eyes with him, her stare full of terror, her arms unnaturally still, everything he thought he stood for began to unravel. What if the protocol he lived by was the very thing endangering her life? This wasn't just a parade, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Under the blinding Virginia sun, Elias Monroe stood motionless, his frame cloaked in a pristine Navy ceremonial uniform, white gloves tight across veined hands. The brass buttons on his chest shimmered in defiance of time, a gleam that belied the ache in his knees and the weight in his heart. Around him, Fort Ward Park teemed with life. Children chased each other across the grass, families unfolded picnic blankets, the scent of grilled hot dogs mixed with the distant churn of a brass band. Red, white, and blue flapped on bunting and hats alike, but Elias heard none of it. He'd been trained to ignore everything: heat, crowds, screams, but not the silent cry from a child's eyes. The morning had begun in the usual way. Elias at his kitchen table, pinning medals onto his jacket with careful, almost sacred precision. He took a long look at the photo frame near the sink, his daughter, age 6, before her curls grew out and her eyes lost their shine. The same girl he hadn't seen in 8 years, not since the custody hearing that ended in quiet humiliation. Not since he'd promised to walk away rather than drag her through his grief. His thumb brushed the small tattoo just above his wrist, a simple anchor. Once, it had stood for stability. Now it was a reminder of things lost at sea. Outside, Lieutenant Mason waited by the transport van, sunglasses tucked neatly into his front pocket. "You know," he said lightly, "this may be your last season, Elias. Retirement board's meeting next week." Elias didn't respond. Mason wasn't being cruel, just procedural. The lieutenant had never seen Elias before he became a statue with a rifle. Didn't know that once he'd led reconnaissance units through desert storms. Didn't know the story behind the quiet. By 11 a.m., Elias stood in full formation beside 2 younger guards whose boots still creaked when they shifted. He didn't need to glance sideways to know they were watching him, not out of respect, but calculation. If the old man swayed in this heat, if he blinked too long, there'd be talk. The ceremony began on schedule. A local congressman approached the podium, voice amplified through cracking speakers. Elias didn't register the words. His body knew how to remain still, even if his mind drifted. Then he saw her. She stood no more than 20 feet away, just beyond the roped-off perimeter. A black girl, no older than 9, in denim overalls and sneakers too clean for the dusty grass. Her arms were crossed tightly, not in defiance, but containment. She didn't smile, didn't fidget. Her eyes were locked on Elias with an intensity that unsettled him. There was no tug at her hand, no guardian scanning the crowd, calling her name. Just that unbroken stare. Elias's discipline wavered. Just for a second. His gaze flicked to hers, and something behind her pupils, something raw and desperate, slammed into his chest like shrapnel. A memory bled through. The courtroom. The judge saying his daughter needed a more stable environment. The sterile hospital room, his wife's hand already cold. The monitor flatlining without drama. He blinked once, almost imperceptibly. The girl still didn't move. Then he saw the man behind her, well-dressed, mid-40s, with sunglasses perched atop his scalp and a calm veneer that tried too hard. His hand gripped the girl's shoulder, not resting but controlling. She flinched beneath it. The man leaned down to whisper something in her ear, lips moving slowly. Elias's breath caught. He'd seen fathers, real ones. He'd seen predators too, men who knew how to mask control as affection. This man didn't look down at her like a parent. He didn't even pretend. A whisper, not aloud but from someplace deep and involuntary, stirred inside Elias's chest. That's not her father. He didn't move. Couldn't. The weight of 30 years of protocol, of training, of knowing when to intervene and when to stand down, all pressed into his spine. But those eyes, that silence, and suddenly the celebration around him, balloons bouncing, children squealing, flags fluttering, felt grotesque, a charade. because something was terribly wrong, and he was the only one who saw it. Still, Elias didn't break formation. Not yet, but his fingers curled slightly tighter around the ceremonial rifle, and his eyes never left the girl. Her name, he thought, must be something soft, something like— But the thought scattered as the man's hand tightened again, and she shrank inward. He shifted the weight on his feet imperceptibly, because if she looked at him one more time, if she made the sign, he thought she might. He wasn't sure he could stay still. A raised thumb, a closing fist. The signal traveled further than any scream could. The sun had climbed, casting sharp white light over the thinning shade. Fort Ward Park vibrated with the scent of sunscreen, hot dogs, and melted ice cream. Children squealed near a bubble machine while patriotic brass echoed louder from the amphitheater. The illusion of joy was total, except for Elias Monroe. He stood in perfect posture, his eyes unfocused in that practiced way guards learned, to look straight ahead, but see everything. He had counted 12 strollers, 2 minor altercations over blanket space, and now he was counting heartbeats. The girl was still there. She hadn't moved much, just shifted from foot to foot, the way a child might if they needed the bathroom or weren't allowed to speak. But there was no childlike wonder in her eyes, only calculation, fear. Her long-sleeved dress clung oddly to her arms despite the rising heat. She didn't fan herself, didn't sip water, didn't blink more than necessary. Elias tracked her the way a wolf might track the twitch of a branch in a still forest. Peripheral, measured, nothing overt, and yet inside, his body hummed with unease. The man beside her, Gregory Vance, laughed too easily. He knelt at one point, motioning for the girl to smile. She didn't. Still, he raised his phone and snapped a photo. As she lifted her arms in confusion or habit, the fabric slipped just slightly. Elias's gaze sharpened. There, barely visible beneath the cuff, the bruises didn't look fresh, but they didn't look old either. The kind of bruises you got from restraint, not play. He felt something cold settle in his chest. A memory stirred. Months ago, a department-wide security memo about a silent distress signal, a child folding their thumb into their palm, then wrapping their fingers over it. The instructions were clear. Assume immediate danger. React with discretion. Elias had deleted the message, assumed it didn't apply to ceremonial guards. A group of tourists walked past, American flags on their t-shirts. One woman stopped, cocking her head toward Nia. "Is that little girl lost?" she asked Elias. He didn't move. His orders were to remain expressionless. Engaging the public was strictly prohibited unless initiated by a designated VIP. The woman waited, frowning, then muttered something about useless statues, and walked on. Nia's eyes flicked toward Elias. Her mouth parted, but no sound emerged. Slowly, as if each movement cost her something, she raised her right hand. Her thumb curled into her palm. Her other fingers folded over it. It was quick, deliberate. His spine turned to iron. He didn't blink. The tension in Elias's body was now volcanic, pressurized and silent. The crowd saw a veteran guard at attention, but inside Elias's every nerve shrieked. He had waited his whole life for instructions, for chains of command, for official orders. Now, a child he'd never met had just sent a message no one else saw and expected him to choose. A few feet away, Vance adjusted his sunglasses and looked around, casually scanning. When his eyes met Elias's, he offered a tight smile, as if to say, "Nothing to see here." But Elias didn't smile back. His hands, still glued to the ceremonial rifle, began to sweat. Nia glanced at him again. Her lips moved, barely. Elias read them. "Help me." 2 syllables. Like a detonation inside his chest. He heard something that wasn't there. His ex-wife's voice, calm and resigned. "You know, Eli tradition is armor. But even armor cracks when no one sees you bleeding." He had spent decades letting blood soak into metal. Behind her, Vance leaned in, whispering something. His hand clamped around her wrist. Her posture folded slightly, like a paper bird crumpling inward. She was being pulled away. The crowd surged as a trio of veterans stepped up to the podium for the next speech. Children laughed at a man on stilts juggling red balls. Life moved forward. Nia was being erased in real time. Elias's heart slammed against his ribs. He didn't breathe, couldn't. Then, imperceptibly, his left boot shifted. An inch, out of line, out of formation. out of protocol. But in that inch was rebellion. In that inch was the first crack. He didn't know what he would do next. But something inside him had just decided it would no longer watch. For 322 years, no guard had broken formation. Elias did, without regret. The moment his boot moved, it was as though time hesitated, startled, uncertain. The crowd didn't notice right away. The fanfare and July sunlight veiled the breach in tradition. But Elias Monroe was already walking. One step, another. The rhythm of his boots over flagstones sliced through the patriotic brass like a wrong note. Cameras turned. A murmur started, thin as a ripple, then thickened into collective gasps. Tourists blinked behind their phones, unsure if they were witnessing a show or a scandal. Elias no longer felt the heat or the weight of his uniform, only the pulse hammering behind his ears and the widening distance between Naya and himself. Vance had nearly reached the parking lot when Elias's voice rang out, deep and absolute. "Park security, release the girl." It wasn't barked like a command. It was steadier than that, a truth stated with no room left for argument. Vance turned with a leisurely grace, his posture casual but his jaw tight. The girl froze. Her small hand had been wrapped around Vance's fingers like a dead vine. Now she yanked it back and took a step closer to Elias. "I'm sorry, sir." Vance raised one hand, revealing a glossy leather wallet. "She's my niece. We're leaving. Diplomatic clearance, if that matters." The badge gleamed under the sun, embossed, official. A few nearby tourists glanced uneasily at each other, then resumed filming. Elias didn't move. "She made the signal," he said. Vance's smile flattened. "What signal?" Elias's voice remained calm. "You know which." A low cough crackled from the speaker system nearby, as if the band, uncertain how to continue, was stalling for time. The American flag was about to be raised. People had started turning toward the pole. Then came the sound of heels, measured, official, crossing pavement. Lieutenant Denise Carrington approached, her navy blue uniform crisp, her expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. She had the bearing of someone used to quelling disorder, not engaging in it. "Monroe," she said, "this is unusual." "He's attempting to leave with the girl," Elias replied. She gave a distress signal, thumb folded. Carrington's lips didn't move for a beat. Then she turned her face toward Nia. "Is that true, sweetheart?" Nia didn't answer. Her chin dipped, eyes lowered. "Child isn't speaking," Vance cut in, smile now acid. "She's been traumatized by family loss. I'm the appointed guardian." Elias took another step forward, slow and unthreatening, but impossible to ignore. "She asked for help." Carrington held up one hand. Her voice was clipped but calm. "Mr. Vance, I'll need a moment to verify. Please stay on site. I'm due in Arlington in 20. I'm not asking." She turned her shoulders slightly, pressing the mic at her collar. "This is Lieutenant Carrington. Possible code Sierra. Child endangerment with diplomatic interference. Initiating lockdown." Silence smothered the crowd. A father holding a soda dropped his cup. Children stopped mid-giggle. A drone camera hovered in place like a startled insect. Nia looked up, eyes glassy but locked on Elias. Carrington's hand went to her hip, resting lightly near her radio. She glanced sideways at Elias. "You just made this very complicated, Monroe." Elias straightened, the sun carving shadows into the lines of his face. "I can live with complicated," he said. The shrill blare of an emergency tone echoed through the park speakers. Ribbons fluttered against the windless sky as the flag ceremony froze mid-motion. From the parking lot, 2 security carts were already rushing in. No one spoke. No one clapped. No one looked away. He thought the badge would protect him. But truth has a way of burning through forged gold. The security station inside Fort Ward Park was colder than the July sun outside suggested. The flicker of surveillance screens danced across metal walls, painting uneasy shadows on the floor. In the corner, Nia sat quietly, legs dangling from the vinyl bench, back straight, hands folded like she was used to pretending she wasn't afraid. Elias Monroe stood near the doorway, neither blocking it nor moving aside. His posture was relaxed, on the surface. But the slight tilt of his chin, the way his gaze tracked every twitch of Vance's shoulder, betrayed readiness. Lieutenant Carrington leaned over the desk, reviewing the laminated badge Gregory Vance had laid out like a trophy. U.S. diplomatic clearance. Level 3. Issued through the Madrid consulate, she read aloud, tone flat. Vance smiled thinly. I told you, Lieutenant. The girl is in my care. Her mother passed. Father unknown. The consulate granted temporary custody. Papers? Elias asked without turning. They're in the vehicle. Locked glove box. Vance's tone was breezy, but there was a thread of wire underneath. I'd be happy to retrieve them. Carrington cut in. You'll stay put. Vance raised both palms. Patient. Of course. Carrington turned to Nia. Her voice softened. Honey, what's your name? Vance stepped forward. She doesn't speak to strangers. Trauma. The girl lifted her chin. Amara, she whispered. Amara Diallo. Carrington didn't react at first. But Elias saw it, the way her pen slipped from her hand, the way her lips parted, then clamped shut. She tapped a key on the terminal and leaned over the screen. Spell that? She asked. Amara spoke slower. D-I-A-Y-O. A silence unfolded, heavy and uneven. Carrington's brow furrowed. Then her eyes widened, only slightly. But enough. What is it? Elias asked. Carrington's fingers flew across the keyboard. A red overlay spread across the screen. In bold letters. Interpol red notice. Active. Elias read from behind her. Child missing since May. Dual citizenship. Daughter of Dr. Celeste Diallo, former RX Biopharma whistleblower. The air in the room shifted, like static before a storm. Carrington picked up her radio. Command, this is Fort Ward. I need a patch through to the D.C. field office. Red level threat. Subject confirmed as Amara Diallo. Immediate custody required. Do not, repeat, do not release child under any circumstance. A brief squawk of acknowledgement crackled back. Vance's smile didn't break, but something else did. A muscle at the base of his neck twitched. His fingers tapped his thigh, then slid into the pocket of his blazer. Elias's eyes locked on that motion. His body tensed. Not obvious, not enough to draw attention from Carrington, but enough to shift his weight toward the girl. Across the room, Amara watched, silent, unmoving. Vance cleared his throat. I think I'd like to contact my legal counsel. Do that, Carrington said, still watching her screen. But you're not leaving. The surveillance monitors blinked, momentarily catching sunlight reflecting from a windshield outside. In that brief flicker, Elias saw Vance's silhouette stretch, his shadow falling over the girl, dark and imposing. But the moment the Interpol alert pulsed on screen, red and alive, it lit Amara's small face in full. The shadow dissolved. Behind Elias, a subtle shift in air pressure. He turned his head just enough. Vance's right hand was moving, slowly, toward the inner pocket of his coat. When the predator realized the trap was closing, he reached for the only tool he had left, violence. The narrow corridor pulsed with artificial light, the kind that hummed with a cold flicker overhead. Concrete walls offered no echo, just a sterile silence that seemed to stretch Elias Monroe's nerves thin. Behind them, the surveillance room was locked down. Ahead, at the end of the passage, a reinforced exit gate stood sealed, steel bolts bracing it against whatever storm now curled above the park. Vance, no, Mercer, as they would soon confirm, stood with one foot behind the other, weight shifted, shoulders angled. His right hand still hovered near the inside of his coat. Elias's gaze didn't move, but every fiber of muscle tightened with readiness. Naya, Amara, remained behind him, pressed close to the wall, her fingers clasping the side seam of her dress. You've made a mistake, Mercer said quietly. All of you. The calm didn't convince anyone now. The sharp edge beneath his voice was rising, tremoring. Carrington's voice came through the radio. U.S. Marshal inbound. 2 minutes out. Elias didn't reply. He watched Mercer's breath shorten, watched his eyes, darting now, calculating, and then the mask cracked. With sudden speed, Mercer lunged, not at Elias, but to the side, grabbing Naya by the upper arm. A flicker of silver flashed in his right hand, short and ugly. The girl cried out, her legs scrabbling for traction on the slick floor. The knife pressed close against her neck. "Get me a vehicle," he barked. "Now, or I open her throat." Elias lifted both hands, slow, palms out. "You're not walking out of here." "Try me," Mercer hissed. His knuckles were white around the hilt of the blade. Naya's eyes found Elias's. They were wide, unblinking, but steady. He blinked once, just once, the tiniest nod. Her heel came down, hard, on Mercer's foot. She twisted, bit into his hand with all the strength in her small jaw. He screamed. That was the break. Elias moved. 2 precise steps. Fluid, trained. His left arm swept Mercer's wrist upward. The blade clattered to the floor. His right foot pivoted behind Mercer's knee, dropping the man in a sharp, snapping arc. A twist, a hold, shoulder pinned, elbow locked. Mercer thrashed. "You don't know who I work for," he roared. His voice echoed against the cold walls. Elias leaned down, the calm in his voice razor sharp. "I don't need to. You forgot who you were taking on. A child who still had hope." Behind them, a door burst open. Footsteps. Marshal Rodriguez entered, badge in one hand, cuffs in the other. "Stand clear." Elias stepped back. Rodriguez moved in, cuffing Mercer swiftly. Seconds later, Carrington's voice rang out behind them. "Interpol match confirmed. Subject is Julian Mercer. Wanted in 6 countries. Multiple counts of abduction, corporate blackmail, false identity." Mercer didn't speak again, just stared at Elias, something between fury and disbelief. Naya moved slowly. Her knees trembled, but she didn't fall. She crossed the 2 feet that separated her from Elias and reached for his uniform sleeve. Her fingers barely brushed the fabric, then tightened. "My mom said someone would come," she whispered. "I didn't think it'd be you. Some legacies are worn on the chest. Others are forged in one impossible moment." The July sun hung directly above the Capitol, casting crisp shadows across the marble steps. Cameras lined the lawn, their lenses glinting like 1,000 quiet eyes. Flags stirred faintly in the still air. A podium had been set, flanked by federal officials in dark suits. In front of it, standing in full ceremonial dress, Elias Monroe held his posture with the same reverence he'd once reserved for battlefield salutes. He was no longer anonymous. To the world, he was the guard who had broken 322 years of protocol to save a child. To her, he was simply the man who had listened when no one else had. Nia Amara stood beside him in a pale yellow dress, her hand wrapped around his gloved fingers. Her curls were brushed back, a small white barrette on one side. She smiled, but only at him. Dr. Celeste Diallo stood nearby, arms folded gently across her chest, her eyes moist but steady. Reunited with her daughter, she had said little publicly, but the grip of her hand on Amara's shoulder told the truth loud enough. The president stepped forward, document in hand. "In the face of silence," he began, "Elias Monroe chose to hear. In the face of tradition, he chose truth. And because of that choice, we now enact the Monroe Protocol, a law that empowers ceremonial guards, federal civilians, and appointed personnel to respond to child safety signals without fear of disciplinary consequence." A cheer rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Elias remained still until he was called to the podium. He walked with the same deliberate pace he'd used for decades, but this time, the rhythm felt lighter. The medal hung at his chest, newly pinned, but his fingers reached instead for the speech in his pocket. He unfolded it, looked down, then looked up again. "I won't read this," he said. His voice was calm. "Because what matters was never what I prepared to say. It was what she," he glanced at Nia, said without speaking. A hush fell again. "I only stepped forward," he continued. "She spoke first." The applause came slowly, then built, a wave of sound that surrounded him, but never touched the still center where he stood. From the edge of the crowd, a figure caught his attention. A woman, slim, composed, holding a young girl by the hand. His ex-wife, his daughter. They weren't there for the cameras. No signs, no words, just her nod. A look filled with something time had muted, but never erased. Elias's breath caught for half a second. Then he reached into his inner pocket, not for the medal, but for a folded piece of paper, a child's drawing. Wobbly lines, a man in uniform beside a smiling girl. Above them, in crooked handwriting, some heroes don't shout, they just listen. He folded it once more. Then, as the applause rose, Elias removed one glove with practiced care. The tattoo on his wrist, his daughter's birth date, was visible for the first time in public. He tucked the note into the same pocket, over his heart, and stood there, not as a guard, not as a symbol, but as a man who had chosen to listen. The applause faded, but the memory of her hand in his remained, a quiet weight, more lasting than any medal. Elias had spent a lifetime behind walls of discipline and silence, only to find that a child's wordless plea could cut deeper than orders ever did. In a world too quick to judge by titles or uniforms, justice came not with thunder, but with stillness and a shift of the heart. When we stop assuming who deserves to be heard, we begin to hear what truly matters. If this story moved you, pass it on to someone who might still be waiting for their moment to be seen.